Releasing our 2022 homicide report. This is a report that is now available online that gives a snapshot of the instances of homicides across the city and various factors about those homicides, including the clearance rates and motives, weapons, and so forth. I'm joined today by Assistant Chief Al Labrada of the Office of Special Operation. Joined with him is also Chief of Detectives, Deputy Chief Chris Pitcher, our Assistant Commanding Officer of Detective Bureau, Commander Jay Mastic, and the person who actually pulls on the numbers together, him and his staff, and that's the captain of our ComStat division, Damian Wyma. So today, as I said earlier, is our release of our 2022 homicide report. And in framing this, more than any other crime, we recognize that homicides devastate communities. It grips people with fear. It causes immeasurable damage to families, friends, and loved ones. LAPD devotes extraordinary resources in both personnel and technology to solve these heinous crimes. Our most seasoned detectives often find themselves working homicides in a lifelong effort to bring justice to these families that suffer these extraordinary crimes. Those detectives work in one of 4 geographic bureaus across the city, as well as our robbery homicide division. In 2022, the city of Los Angeles ended with 382 homicides that occurred that year. That's 20 fewer than the 402 that occurred in 2021, a 5% decrease. Now, within this report, you'll also see 5 additional homicides that were added pursuant to the FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Guidelines. So these were undetermined deaths that occurred in a previous calendar year, but then following information from the coroner's office had been reclassified as a homicide. In our year in review, these 20 fewer homicides, this 5% reduction, did not lay out or roll out evenly across the entire city. In South Bureau, essentially the command south of the 10 freeway, saw the largest decrease in the number of homicides with 27 fewer homicides. That's a 16% reduction. Conversely, Operations Valley Bureau, the San Fernando Valley, experienced a 14% increase, or 8 additional homicides. That increase was only surpassed by the number of the increase in the number of gang-related homicides in Valley Bureau. Proud to say that our community safety partnership sites, those 10 sites across the city, had a total of 5 homicides in 2022. That number stood at 17 in 2021 and 6 in 2019. Last year, on our 10 sites, 7 of them within the Community Safety Partnership Bureau had 0 homicides. And year to date, there have been no homicides in any of the 10 sites. Our top premise as far as where these crimes are occurring remains outside, in public places, with 58% of homicides occurring in those outside locations. The top weapon remains a firearm at 75% of our homicides. Within the homicides being represented by gun violence, the department seized 8,427 firearms in 2022. And while that's 234 fewer than 2021, when you look at the rate of increase in our violence, the rate of our gun seizures these last few years have similarly increased. A 21% increase was what these numbers represent between 2022 and 2019, and a 78% increase in the number of firearms seized from 10 years earlier. It's a startling statistic when you look at in 2012, we seized 4,724 firearms. Last year, that number stood at 8,427. And within that, we know that 2 out of 10 firearms today are ghost guns, unserialized weapons. I'm happy to report that in our efforts to solve these crimes and bring justice to these families, we did see a 10% increase in our clearance rate, rising from 68% in 2021 to 75% in 2022. This was a 34% increase from 2020, where we solved only 56%. It's one of our all-time lows. In the year that saw a substantial increase in homicides in 2020 from the previous year. Our clearance rates of homicides, the information within our report also includes cases that were cleared sorted by ethnicity and gender of the victim. For example, in 2022, the department solved 100% of female black homicides and 84% of females that were Hispanic. Domestic violence, family violence, saw 5 fewer homicides than in 2021, but that number was still higher than 2 years ago. Our homeless-related homicides, unfortunately, has continued to rise, a phenomenon we've seen for these last number of years. This last year, 2 additional homicide victims were identified as persons experiencing homelessness. That stands at 107 versus 105. Troubling about this is that's 29% of all homicides in the city of Los Angeles. This situation continues to worsen when in 2020, that number was 71%. I'm sorry, that number was 71. So we have a 55% increase from 2020 to 2022 in the number of homicides involving persons who are houseless or unhoused. Our gang-related homicides continue to improve this last year with the lowest overall percentage in 2022 for the last 3 years, representing 51% of homicides citywide. However, to point that improvement, I'm encouraged. However, we still see that gang-related homicides represent more than half all homicides in the city of Los Angeles. There were 36 fewer gang-related homicides in 2022, a 16% increase. There were 4 fewer than there were in 2020. 3 of our geographic bureaus all saw decreases in the number of gang-related homicides. The outlier of that was Valley Bureau. The San Fernando Valley saw an increase with 8 additional gang-related homicides versus the year before. Southeast also had the highest number of homicides for the last 2 years, but I'm encouraged that we did see a marked reduction in the number of homicides that were gang-related in Southeast. Now, strategies that have been employed to get us to this point have been our continued focus on violent crime investigations, as well as effective community outreach and engagement. Despite an extraordinary reduced workforce, with the support of Mayor Bass and Mayor Garcetti, we've added overtime hours to bolster deployment and to focus on added uniform patrols, foot beats, and violent crime investigations. We continue our coordination with GRID resources also to prevent retaliatory violence and calm tensions in our neighborhoods. This coordination goes far beyond our partnering during summer night lights and gun buybacks. It's work at the street level every day that allows these peacemakers to quell rumors and misinformation. We've centralized our homicide investigators citywide over the last 3 years into larger units, affording the department the ability to muster large numbers of detectives during the initial hours of a homicide, when it's most crucial time. Targeted firearms-related cases has also proved to be successful, as we're now working with the federal government as well as our local DA to enhance gun charges, both in sentencing as well as in bail. Additionally, we've expanded our joint task forces with the ATF and the FBI specifically to target gun traffickers and gun violence. Our thanks to the U.S. Attorney for the Central District, Martin Estrada, and his staff, as well as our local DA's office, for their prosecution on gun charges, not only on traffickers, but those that are committing gun violence, including those that are committing gun violence in something short of a homicide. This last year, in our pursuit of ghost gun traffickers, these are unserialized weapons, to stem the flow of these deadly weapons, we've partnered with Crime Stoppers LA to solicit tips and leads on those traffickers. As I said earlier, 20%, 2 out of every 10 guns that we seize are ghost guns. And we know that the reason for such unserialized weapons is for prohibited possessors, because they have no other way of obtaining that weapon lawfully. Going forward, we'll continue our work in effective community outreach and engagement, including our nationally recognized CSP sites and our most violent-prone communities, as well as our uniformed foot beats and patrol. Our partners with our communities include our houses of faith, schools, and local groups to help identify those who are impacted by gun violence. As our efforts going forward also will be to increase a number of personnel in a number of our homicide details. Particularly in the Valley Bureau, we're seeing an increased number of retirements. And people, as they've aged out of this profession, tenured, very accomplished homicide detectives, but the numbers of their staffing there has dwindled in this last year. So we'll be looking to add additional homicide investigators to that workforce to help improve their performance and also bring justice to these families. Lastly, I want to announce today that we're releasing, as we stand here now, a new website on LAPD Online. It is our homicide website. That website will have a picture, a name, and a date of occurrence for every homicide that occurred this last year. And going forward, will include photographs as families, pursuant to families' wishes, of homicide victims. as well as whether or not an arrest has been made relative to that case. The effort of bringing this information forward is to continue to help sensitize us as a city about the terrible impact that gun violence has in our neighborhoods and on lives across our city. It's our hope that as people see those victims, recognize that they represent a life not just lost, but a devastation for an entire family, that'll help drive our communities to help in the most crucial resource, and that is their voice, and helping us understand those responsible for this gun violence. Now, I am happy as we come into complete the first quarter of this year to report that as we stand here today, we continue to see a reduction in homicides and shooting victims. Year to date, we've had 55 homicides as of this past Saturday, which is a 32% decrease from the same period last year. Year to date, we've also seen a 15% reduction in the number of shooting victims for an overall violent crime reduction of 12% versus 2022. And in comparison to 2019, which is essentially our pre-COVID base year, we now have a 1.4% decrease in violent crime in our city. Our challenges in violent crime continues to be far too much gun violence and far too many guns. However, we do believe that the strategies that we're employing, including community members helping us identify those that are trafficking in these weapons, increased enhancements of bail as well as sentencing for those that are involved in gun violence, that those are circumstances and levers that are being pulled that are providing the types of results that we're here today to talk about. With that, we have Assistant Chief Labrada, who will provide a Spanish version, and then we're going to come back and take questions from the group. Chief Labrada.
Thanks, Chief. Muy buenas tardes. Gracias por estar con nosotros. Voy a dar unos comentarios en español y después tomamos preguntas si gustan tener preguntas individualmente. Gracias por estar hoy aquí por parte del jefe Moore. Lamentablemente hoy revelamos nuestro reporte de homicidios del 2022. En este caso, cada de estas vidas representa a un familiar, alguien que murió el año pasado. En este reporte explicamos las estadísticas de las vidas perdidas por la violencia y el crimen en la ciudad de Los Ángeles. El reporte está dividido en distintas zonas de la ciudad para representar el número de las víctimas por dónde están viviendo y, más importante, qué tipo, hombres o mujeres. Exploramos estrategias y estadísticas, esperamos ayudar a superar la violencia para 2023, para mejorar los números y reducción de violencia en el 2023. En 2022 tuvimos un total de 382 homicidios. Eso significa 20 víctimas menos, una disminución de 5% de toda la ciudad desde 2021, cuando tuvimos 402. Nuestro departamento reportó 387 víctimas de homicidio al Departamento de Justicia de California en 2022. Y aquí, 5 muertos de años anteriores fueron reclasificados como homicidios en 2022. Lo más notable es la disminución del 16% observado en el sur de Los Ángeles, que ha bajado los números de víctimas, que tuvo 140 homicidios, 27 homicidios menos del 2021, en el cual se reportaron 167. Más importante es, en 2022 nuestros detectives aclararon el 75% de sus casos, es decir, que investigaron y buscaron a alguien culpable de estos delitos. Esto incluye homicidios de años anteriores que se aclararon en 2022 y se basa en los 387 homicidios totales informados al Departamento de Justicia durante el 2022. Hubo un aumento del 6% en el número de homicidios aclarados en 2022 en comparación al 2021. Aclararon un total de 291 homicidios en 2022, que son 16 más que los 275 del 2021. De los 200 homicidios aclarados, las víctimas pertenecen a las siguientes etnias: 5 asiáticos, 100% aclarados de esos casos, 121 afroamericanos, 76% aclarados, y 126 hispanos, 72% aclarados en los casos. En esos casos, 13 otros, 118 fueron aclarados por estas investigaciones. En 2022, el centro de Los Ángeles, 75% de los homicidios fueron aclarados por la investigación. En el sur de Los Ángeles, 83% de los homicidios fueron aclarados por investigación de los detectives. En el oeste, 98% de los homicidios fueron aclarados. En el Valle, 65%. Pistolas, en este caso, disminuyeron 234, que es bajado de 2.7% en comparación del 2021. En 2022, las pistolas, desde el 31 de diciembre, aumentaron 2.165 armas, es decir, más de 34% en comparación con 2008 que recuperamos de armas. 2022, las pistolas fantasmas, como ustedes saben, ha subido los números en la comunidad. El 31 de diciembre han bajado de 215, aún hemos estado viendo que muchas armas de fantasmas continúan a las comunidades. El jefe Moore continúa los esfuerzos con muchas compañeras, haciendo alianzas con las comunidades. Una de las cosas que ha hecho el departamento es el WeTip Hotline, que podemos ofrecer recompensas a las personas que están dando información acerca de armas fantasmas, a personas que están armando, y más importante, lo que estamos haciendo con nuestra comunidad para trabajar juntos para reportar estos delitos y poder investigar estos homicidios. Muchas gracias por su atención y tomamos preguntas.
Chief Labrada, thank you. One other thing I want to add, and that is just a footnote. In the audit of this work, we have a record management system that is antiquated, out of date, and is paper-based in many instances. So as we prepare today for this press conference, and looking at the Valley Bureau, a hand audit was done because of particular attention was drawn when you see a 65% clearance rate in comparison to other parts. So I'm happy to report that a hand audit of each of those cases resulted in identifying some additional cases that actually were cleared last year. They were solved, which actually improves their clearance rate to 81%. And actually that raises our overall clearance rate from 75% to about 77, 78%. So the general trend, I make that footnote here because the general trend is in the right direction. They are solving the cases at an advanced clip, at a higher rate, one of the highest rates in American policing when you look at large police agencies. And that is reflective across the entire organization. And I want to thank every homicide investigator. I want to extend my appreciation to each command, to every community member who's been a part of the solution of bringing to justice those who are responsible for these heinous crimes. When we look at whether it be domestic violence, persons who are houseless, gang-related violence, the loss of life in each of these areas has a significant impact, a lasting impact on a person's sense of justice, of fairness, of just a right to exist. And so I applaud the work of whether it be those homicide detectives that are working tirelessly. They sacrifice so much for their family and with their own lifestyle in order to work the hours and pursue justice to achieve this. I also want to thank our scientific investigative personnel, our forensics, our photographers, our DNA analysts. The technology that we have the ability to use today is helping us, again, identify those responsible. And so now, with that, I'll now answer any questions or direct it to one of the people here who can better answer it.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Question on, you talk about gender and you were talking about race and ethnicity. Can you talk a little bit about these crimes and their connection or nexus to any hate incidents or hate crimes? Any conflict?
Well, we know that I'm not familiar of a hate-related. As I stand here today, I'd have to audit against that lens. We do know that hate violence, hate crimes are up substantially, particularly as we see most recently with the violence in West LA with the 2 victims as they exited their house of worship. So shooting violence involving them, hate violence involving Jewish persons of a Jewish identity, as well as LGBTQ, bisexuals, African American, Hispanic. No group has really been left out. But I'll have to get back with you as far as any of these hate-related or hate-motivated, if you will, homicides.
And I don't know if for you or Chief Pitcher, but what are the top motivations or the top motives for homicide?
So generally, when you look through the report, you'll see on the pages when we come into the motivation. Just a moment, Chris. Okay.
Yeah, Steve, the top 3 motivations for homicides last year, the first one was dispute-related incidents, and then followed by gang-related incidents, and then the third most noteworthy MO was robbery associated, and those basically attributed to about 52% of our total homicides last year. Those were the top 3 MOs.
While I have you there, what would you attribute the high clearance rate to?
The high clearance rate is a collaboration of everything that the chief talked about, all of the programs that are in place, the hard work of the homicide detectives. They've got the tip lines going on. They've got, everything associated and working together collaboratively. In addition to, I think what we do here in Los Angeles, where it's not done in a lot of major cities, is every homicide that is not immediately solved is brought before a committee. And in that committee, that's Commander Mastic. Those are the commanding officers of Robbery Homicide Division, of a series of homicide expert investigators, as well as the individuals from the technical lab as well as the forensics lab, and they talk about every aspect of these homicides, the circumstances, the statements, the evidence, everything, to make sure that there is no stone left unturned and there is appropriate and adequate strategies in terms of investigations moving forward, so that has the best solve rate possible. And in addition to that, we've also put an emphasis on the cold case aspect, going back and ultimately looking at the cold cases. We've brought back retired detectives, we've brought back retired reserve officers, and in some cases volunteers to work collectively together with investigators from Homicide Special Section at Robbery Homicide Division to look at those cold case or cases that have not been solved in some time to make sure that they are worked on too and they get solved. But I think it's a collaboration of everything that we're doing here, from the outside, from the tip lines, from the incredible investigators, to the labs, to everybody that comes together, also with the interventionists collectively to solve these cases. From the information we learn from the outside to all of the everything that we put and apply towards that investigation, and ultimately everything that is learned produces that high solve rate.
My last question is, are you seeing an increase in participation from the public?
In terms of
Tips?
yes, absolutely. We're getting tips and leads in relation to, and that's one of the reasons for that homicide website, for those that have not been solved, ultimately to identify suspects, to glean information, to ultimately give us more witnesses to talk to, more video to review. We're getting tips from the public, not only in terms of what has happened and transpired out there, but gang-related, the disputes, everything collectively, the top 3 motivators. We're receiving tips from the outside to the homicide units, as well as to the tip units in gang and narcotics division, the gun details, everything that leads towards a successful resolution of a homicide case. Yes, we are starting to see more involvement by the public.
Name and title for the record, please.
I am Deputy Chief Chris Pitcher. I am the Chief of Detectives, Commanding Officer of Detective Bureau.
Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome.
Either Chief Pitcher or Chief Moore, can you, obviously we had the pandemic. Can you talk about whether or not were your detectives finding difficulties during the pandemic, reaching out to people, finding people who would give you tips? Was that a complicating factor why the clearance rate fell during the pandemic?
Yes, certainly every part of societal fabric broke down. Isolation, people feeling alone, disenfranchised. We saw the increase in violence with people resorting to violence over trivial matters. The bar of civility dropped to a terrible point, but then so did participation. What I'm pleased by is that as we come out of the pandemic, that we're seeing the social fabric restructure, coming back together. We're seeing the impact of schools and the stability they offer families. We're seeing the impact of outreach and engagement by our gang youth development, our GRID resources. We're also seeing the criminal justice system come back on board. And then that means that there's consequences. And people that during the pandemic were going out and committing gun violence, that were still back out in the street the next day. And a very disheartening fact is we're soliciting for people to step forward and help us solve these crimes were a sense that there wasn't a consequence. So we are, that's why we're looking at 2019. 2018, 2019, for all Evangelinos to be reminded, was one of the safest periods in our time, in our history, in some 50 years. And we lost it in a very short period of time. These numbers represent the hard work of our organization. Despite its reduction in workforce, it's reimagining, it's prioritizing, and it's a lot of dedication that is producing this. But it's also being done in partnerships with a community that's helping us. As a reminder, when you look at that website and you find a victim there or you have information, Crime Stoppers LA, you can report anonymously. You can provide your information where we can reach back to you with rewards or other ability to help encourage you to bring closure to these families, to these victims' relatives and family members that are just hoping for that some bit of closure to understand what was involved here. It was asked earlier, are we seeing the public engagement? We're seeing it every day. And we'd ask the rest of the public, other members that may have information but have felt hesitant to step forward, is to do so. The safer community is us taking those responsible for gun violence, taking those that would take the life of another individual and removing that individual from our community. The path forward is that is a requirement if we're going to see safer times, which I believe we can.
Just to follow up as well, you know, I think you said over 50% of the cases were gang related, over 50%.
51%.
Over 50% homeless as well. Can you talk
No.
about how the performance or close to that, a high number? How do those communities, the victims or suspects, do they intersect in any way? Can you just talk about that?
Yeah, so let's give the exact stats, and it's in the report, but 29% of our homicides last year in 2022 involved persons who were houseless. We solved 64% of those. When we see the underlying influences of what is motivating those that are being attacked and are losing their life who are unhoused, we do see gang involvement. We see narcotic transactions, and we see disputes. And it's that combination, and by the way, the firearms that are represented in those communities is still very high. When we look at the number of firearms, I believe again 3 out of 4 of those homicides involve a firearm. Yeah, we're taking into account the 5 additional that were added, and then the overall clearance, and that 293. You know, we just in recalculating, we think the accurate number because of Valley Bureau going back and manually auditing that the number is actually 300 of the 380 and the 387. So forgive me, these numbers are going around. And let me apologize to you. I mean, I would love to have placards and boards that have the most recent up-to information, but those numbers, that audit and so forth was done over the weekend and just came back this morning. It is important that we have the most accurate information to you.
But if there were murders that were solved from, say, 2017, last year,
Yes.
that isn't included?
That is included. What happens is the clearance rate, that's why in some of these cases you'll see more than 100% clearance rate. Maybe you'll have a female victim, and that's one case, but there's a prior homicide from an earlier year that involved a female victim. If we solve both those cases, it's a 200% solve rate. So we do, recognizing that many homicides, because of that initial surge, the initial realities that many homicide victims know who the offender is. It's known in their circle, if you will, of connectivity. And that's why it's so important that we get out there with sufficient resources and really surge to gather everything possible to identify. But when those homicides are not solved, and that's what those Tuesday meetings are about, then the investigative work necessary to tie in the forensics, tie in the technical information, to really use the crime scene to tell us and give us information about who's responsible, that can take months and years. Now, what Chief Detectives indicated, Chief Pitcher, we recognize that when we went from just under 260 homicides in 2019, and that number ballooned up well above 385, 390, that has created that 56% solve rate. We've got tens of crimes that are in there that we need to go back and continue to work on. And of course, we know that in certain parts of the city, particularly the South Los Angeles, that we have hundreds of cases that we've never been able to solve. I want to thank the Los Angeles Police Foundation for the establishment of a homicide library that records and is protecting those records and allows us still to drill in and work those cases, because a homicide case that is uncleared in the city is never a closed case.
Baseline for the clearance rate. How's this year
I believe it was like 78 to 80%, somewhere in that area there.
And also, we're following statewide the Unsafe Gun Act that was put a block on by a federal judge. That's 10 years of guns that are coming in with the firearms so high. Are you worried that these guns become to the city and affect the homicide rate?
Yes. When we look at the recent Supreme Court decision this last year that loosened, if you will, what is necessary for a person to have a CCW, a concealed weapon permit, we're issuing those by the dozens today. When you see recent court decisions about California state law, gun laws, we're a Brady A state. I reference that quite a bit. I hope that everyone understands what that qualification is. But states with Brady A grades of added regulations and controls have a substantially lower level of gun violence than we see in other states. I mean, the tune of like 50 to 60% lower. And so anytime we open up those channels, just yesterday across this country, we saw the horrific attack in 3 innocent young people that were murdered, young children, and 3 school administrators by an individual that we still don't understand the motivation, but in her possession or in his possession was 2 assault-style weapons and a firearm, and a manifesto that she left behind indicating, at least early on, some real mental health issues. We know across our country, and certainly here in Los Angeles, we're not immune from it, is that mental illness and mental health are in periods of depression and of individuals who have lost hope and then strike out at others with gun violence is a real phenomenon. So I am troubled moving forward. And what's going to be required is our continued use of what does work. The Armed Prohibited Possessor Systems, the Armed Prohibited Possessors, APPs, those individuals, we work regularly with the California Department of Justice, and they number in the hundreds to go out and ensure that they do not have prohibited weapons. That's why the ghost gun issue, the unserialized weapons, has been such a challenge. It's because these individuals have continued to seek out those weapons, and there's been a ready supply of them. And so I do believe it's our challenge, but we're up for it. And I think that as we bring awareness to this, I'm hopeful that we'll find a way to improve gun violence by lowering the availability of these weapons of war. The assault ban that was weapons ban that expired in 2004 continues to be probably on the national scale the most important piece of legislation that Congress could do, is to give some added measure of control, recognizing there's hundreds of thousands of those weapons out there. But again, we look at automobile safety. We should look at it in the same way. We should look at gun safety the same way with automobile safety, and that is incremental changes over the course of time have made us a safer society and have saved lives. Thank you all.